Well, if you're new to Connection, definitely welcome. I want to share some insider information with you before we get started. So this service is definitely outgrowing the first service. And so as you come in, one of the things that you'll notice, especially if you come closer to the start time, we will not have enough chairs out. We do that on purpose, so this is the insider information. Because if we put up all of them, and you sit in the back, then everybody who comes late has to sit in the front, right? And so if we don't sit out enough, then everybody kind of squeezes in, and then we add more rows. So if you come late and you are capable, just grab a few chairs and stick those out. If you are a regular at Connection, you see a new family come in, just grab some chairs and drop those out there, and that will help us tremendously just as we set up for this service. And it's great to see so many new faces, especially on a day when it's so cold outside, right? So we are in a series called Unlikely Heroes. Unlikely Heroes takes us through a period of time known as the Judges. And so we've just wrapped up with Judges, but we've got one more story, one more book that happens at the same time, but it's not included within the Judges. And I think that there's a good reason for that story to take place outside of what we would call the Judges story. And throughout this year, we've actually been doing an Old Testament survey. So I know that for those who are new to the church, and especially for those who are brand new, like you've just never experienced it, like the Old Testament stories, you may have gotten bits and pieces, but you maybe didn't get the whole picture, and you definitely didn't get like how it all fits together on this one timeline. And so that's kind of given us a picture on how to do that. And if you'd like to get more information about that, I would just encourage you, whether it's through the Church Center app or the Connection website or even on our YouTube channel, you can go back and watch those messages. And if you do so, going back to the beginning of September, you will get kind of this overview of what God is doing in the Old Testament. And I had to pay money to go to a Bible college class to get this kind of information, right? So you guys are getting set up, and I would just encourage you to go do that. There's lots of great resources. For those of you who are in Right Now Media, like each one of these sermon series, we've done some work on the Right Now Media to put in some collections that go along with each one of these and the books of the Bible that we're reading through at that time. So as we dive in here today, we're going to be talking about the story of Ruth. Ruth is going to be found on page 222. The Black Bible will provide if you want to go there. I'm going to try to set the stage a little bit from the angle of Ruth. So Ruth isn't an Israelite, right? She's not part of God's chosen people. She's actually a Moabite. What do we know about the Moabites? Well, there's a couple of things, and it doesn't always sit real well, right? So if we go back to Genesis in chapter 19, we see the story of Lot. Lot is a nephew of Abraham. Abraham is the recipient of the promise of God, that I will give you descendants as numerous as the stars, and I will give you this land that I promised. That's why it's called the Promised Land. But his nephew and him, like they both have a lot of things that just accumulate. God is blessing both of them, and so they kind of split so that they can have room to grow. And Lot gets the first choice of the land, so we kind of know that he's settling in a land that's pretty fertile, right? It's great for agriculture. It's also the land of Sodom and Gomorrah. They are not such good people in Sodom and Gomorrah. God brings down judgment on them. Lot is saved along with his two daughters, but he hides in a cave. And in order to prolong the family name, they do some not so good stuff. They get dad intoxicated and sleep with him. Right? This is not the hey, let's pull up our genealogy and let's sit around and talk about how awesome our family is kind of conversation. Right? But this is the Moabites. Right? And this is where she's living. It's just to the east of the Dead Sea and more towards the south. And the Israelites would have actually left that in the book of Exodus. They would have left Egypt and they would have gone through the area of Moab before crossing the Jordan River to come back to the Promised Land. But they didn't cross it easily. The king of the Moabites didn't want them to come through. And so he hired a prophet, an evil prophet, Balaam, to curse the Israelites, but God wouldn't allow that to happen. If you know the story a little bit, you know the story of the talking donkey. It doesn't just happen in Shrek, it happens in the Word of God too, right? And so they make their way through Moab, but it doesn't go real well. And then we see in Judges chapter 3, the story of Ehud, the left-handed judge. I didn't go into this too much because we were trying to do all the kids here at one time, but this is one of the coolest, gross stories ever, right? So Ehud he's left-handed, so he hides his 18-inch sword on his right thigh, and he takes out the very fat king of the Moabites. He stabs it into his belly, and it says dung came out. If you don't know what that is, you can Google that, right? And the dung came out, and I'm sure it was a fragrant aroma for all to partake in. And this is it recorded in the story of the Judges. And this is the land of the Moabites. This is the land where Ruth is at. There is some hostility. It's kind of an on-again, off-again relationship between Israel and the Moabites, but mostly off-again. Right? Mostly doesn't go well. Now we know that the Israelites are told not to intermarry with people who are living in the Promised Land. Mostly that is the Canaanites. The Moabites are in a separate category. But it's not so much about the nationality as it is about the worship of false gods. And the Moabites also worshipped false gods. And there was one prominent one that was specific to the Moabites that involved, when you worshipped, sacrificing of other humans and even orgies. Right? So this was not the kind of thing that God's people wanted to get caught up in. And yet this was where Ruth was at. So now that we know the setting, Ruth is there, and one day as she's going about her business, I'm telling a little story here. It's not exactly this way, right? So go back and read it, Ruth chapter 1. First 5 verses tell us a whole lot about the setting. Some young man steps into the scene. He's not from town. He's a foreigner. Mahlon was his name. Right? And she gets married to this young man who's moved into the area because his family needed some food on the table. Right? Because back in Bethlehem, their cupboards were bare. They were empty. There was a famine in the land. God used famines, the withholding of rain and food, so that it would grab the attention of his people and they would return to him. And so there was a famine, a physical famine in the land, but there was also a spiritual famine in the land. Interestingly enough, they were from the town of Bethlehem, which we know as the town of David, the king. We know as the town that Jesus was born in. But Bethlehem means house of bread. And at the house of bread, there wasn't any. So they went to the land of Moab. And there Ruth encounters him. But along this journey, he passes away. And not just him. His brother as well, who had also married one of the Moabite ladies, Orpah, and her father-in-law. The 3 men who could protect and provide for the family have now passed away, and they're in a foreign land. This would not be a pleasant place for Ruth to be. And we're actually told that Naomi, her mother-in-law, her name means pleasant. Imagine being in her shoes, right? She gets married to Elimelech. His name means my God is king, right? Probably a little bit of this romance idea. Oh, he is my king, right? And we have 2 children, 2 boys, and an amazing family. And as empty as we are in Bethlehem, my heart is still full because my family is with me. And they make their way to Moab. 10 years later, after the men have passed away, Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem because she hears that the famine has relented. And so she takes the 2 ladies with her. What you don't understand about this culture is that the family would still provide for them. But a lot of that fell on the men. But there was no man in the house. So Ruth and Orpah and Naomi, they pack up and they head back. But this is foreign territory for Ruth and Orpah. But something must have happened in the life that they had lived together, because they seem to have a profound respect for Naomi, that they're willing to leave everything and to follow her. And somewhere along the journey, they get this message from Naomi that says, you know what, ladies? You're free of any obligation here. You can go back to your homes and back to your families and back to your gods. I release you. And neither one of the ladies wanted to go. A little bit further along on the journey, this is all in chapter 1, a little bit further on the journey, she pauses and she tells them again, this time with a bit more information. Because in that culture, if your husband died, that another man from the family, a brother, would take on the role of providing for the family, of protecting and also prolonging the family name. And Naomi says to Ruth and to Orpah, I have no more boys. And even if I were to find a husband and have a child, you're not going to wait that long. Please, just go home. Go back to your family, your people, your God. And Orpah's like, in tears, okay, goodbye. I'll go home. Ruth, though, she utters that famous line, like if you've been to a handful of weddings, you've probably heard this along the way. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I think it's important for us to pause on this segment for a moment and hit a really valuable truth. And that is, we have people all around us who are hurting, who are struggling with life, who have gone through some pretty amazing loss. Right? And they need people like Ruth to come alongside of them. But here's the opposite side of that. The people, when we're hurting, we have a tendency to isolate. We have a tendency to push others out when really we need to be inviting them in. And Ruth said, no, that's not happening. I'm going where you go. Everything about your life, that's going to be my life. And as a church, we need to be able to respond to people who are hurting, who are broken. And my guess is you probably have some in your world right now. Some people who are struggling through life. And maybe they're not so easy to love, because Naomi even begins to say, hey, I know I'm supposed to be pleasant, but bitterness is coming in. Right? They may not be so easy to love. They might be even kind of prickly. They might try to push you out. But as the church, as people who've been extended the grace of God, we need to still come alongside of them and say, ain't no way. Right? There ain't no way you're pushing me away. Because you're too valuable. You're too important. I care too much. Because I know that this is a hard call. It's hard to love people when they don't really want it. It's hard to take the abuse. And there are times, and I just want to preface this, there are times where people can be too abusive and we need to love on them from a distance. And we need to seek some counsel of outside sources so that we can come alongside of them. But my prayer is that Connection, as the church, right, we can come alongside people who are hurting. And there are people here today, there are people who are watching online, right, that you know all too well about this story. Right? You know about how your life can take a turn. And all of the pleasantries, all the things that seem to be going well, just like one at a time, they're taken away from you. And the pleasantness turns to bitterness, turns to brokenness. And you just pull away. And I want you to know that when you step into the church, you step into a family. And if you'll lean into the family of God and let others come alongside of your brokenness, that you don't have to go through it alone. Right? And this is kind of where we see the story of Naomi and Ruth. And as we exit chapter 1 and begin into chapter 2, we begin to see some hope that's on the horizon. It says as they're making their way into Bethlehem, it was the time of the barley harvest. It was the time of the barley harvest. This is important because as Naomi is coming back in, remember they're coming from a place where there wasn't food. Right? They're returning back, and yes, indeed, the stories are true. There's food that's available. And Naomi steps into the town. It's been 10 years since she's left. Some people recognize her. My guess is she's probably changed a little bit. Right? 10 years, hard life, some struggles, brokenness happens, bitterness seeps in, and maybe we look like a shell of our old self, but they still recognize her. Is this Naomi? Is she returning? And her response to them is, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. Because God has allowed some bitter things to happen in my life. I think that as much as we can look at that as a condemnation on God, it's even better to look at that as a provision of God. As God is at work even in the brokenness, even in the hurt and the loss. Even then, Naomi knows that God is still in control. And He's allowed certain things to happen. Doesn't make it any easier, though, does it? Right, and so we push in, and it's the time of the harvest, and Ruth is now the stranger in a foreign land. Ruth is now in a place where she doesn't belong. Right, but she's promised never to leave. Right, I'm going to go where you go. Your God will be my God. Only she's now a widow who doesn't have a child. Right, there's no man to care for her, provide and protect. Probably pretty poor. But God set up this welfare system in Leviticus that if you're harvesting in the field, you leave the edges alone. And those who are poor can come and glean in the fields. And we see in chapter 2, Ruth is asking Naomi permission to go glean in the fields, and she does that. And as she does so, she's working hard, putting in a lot of time, and there's this line in verse 3. And depending on the translation, it maybe words a little bit differently, but mine says, so she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who is of the clan of Elimelech. I like the one that says, it just so happened. This is a play on words. Like this is a literary technique, pointing to the province of God. Right? That even in this, God was present. So out of all the fields that she could have gone to, she went to the one that was owned by Boaz. Boaz, a redeemer in their family. She probably didn't know much about this, but who knows? A redeemer could buy back the property once somebody had passed to prolong the family, could take on the marriage, prolong the family name. So it would start with the brothers, but then it would be the closest relative, the kinsman, the closest relative that would redeem, buy them back. And it just so happened that Boaz was there in that field. And he saw this woman. And he obviously, she caught his eye, and he said, who is this woman? And then he got the story. This is the daughter-in-law of Naomi. Oh. He pulls her in. He's like, I've heard about your story. I've learned how you've stayed by her. You've helped her in this process. And in your kindness, the word here is hesed. It carries so much more meaning than just like pleasantries. Like you went above and beyond to help out your mother-in-law, to be there for your family. And I've taken notice. We begin to see something in Ruth that we haven't seen in Judges. Even though this is in the time of the Judges. The Judges were a lot of times people that didn't have a whole lot of godly character. Right? The people did what was right in their own eyes, and then they would cry out for a Savior, and God would provide a judge, and He would bring redemption, but it wasn't always pleasant. Right? They didn't always go about it the way that in righteousness we would draw that up. And yet we see the character of Ruth providing for her mother-in-law. And then Boaz, he takes note. Not of what she looked like at the moment. You see, character goes a lot deeper. My guess is when she went to the field, she probably wasn't dressed to the nines. Probably didn't have on her expensive perfume or her best clothes, right? She's probably kind of dirty, sweaty, smelly. And in that moment, Boaz recognizes her character. You didn't leave. You could have left, but you were there. And then he prays this prayer. It's found in chapter 2, verse 12. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. You've come to God to provide for you, to give you shelter. And I pray that God does that for you. What a cool prayer. And then he kind of repays the kindness. It's a pay it forward type of moment. The protection, don't go to another field. You could get hurt. Right? This wasn't a place that was without risk, because if they would go to these fields and somebody would try to take advantage of them, they could get hurt, raped, tortured. And yet Boaz says, if you stay in my field, I'll make sure you're taken care of. And he tells his men that are working for him, hey, don't let anything happen to her. And then he provides for her. Not only is she told to continue to glean in the field, to continue to pick up what's left, but she's also given extras. Every once in a while they would just drop a little bit more, and she'd pick that up. And instead of having to go draw water when she was thirsty, instead of her having to draw it for the men, which was common in the culture, he said, if you're thirsty, go get some water from what the men have drawn. And he provides for her. As she leaves that day, it says with an ephah of barley, verse 17. I've heard that anywhere between like 30 and 60 pounds. And then if you were out there gleaning, it would take you about 2 weeks. Right, so she's walking home feeling like Santa Claus probably. Christmas has come. She's got this huge amount of harvest. And Naomi's like, where did you glean today? This is how I hear it, though. Dude, wow, that's a lot of food. Where did you go? What happened? Right, and so she goes, oh, yeah, so I ended up in this field of a guy named Boaz. Boaz? I know Boaz. He's one of our family members. He's one of our redeemers. It just so happened. It just so happened, right, that this woman who was a barren widow, who was poor, a foreigner in a strange land, ended in a place where God would provide for her. And so we get through the harvest, chapter 2. And now in chapter 3, we enter into the kind of the realm of the meddling mother-in-law. Some of you know what that's like. Right? She's got a plan. It's not a bad plan. I mean, they've got a relationship. It's not a bad plan. Hey, if you want to be taken care of, I need to set you up for success. And so if you're going to go out there, you need to make sure you take a bath. For sure, take a bath. Right? Put on some clean clothes. Maybe a little perfume wouldn't be a bad idea. Right? She's now trying to win the heart of the man. Right? And as she goes out to where he's at, continuing to work the remainder of the harvest, not in the field, but in-house at the winnowing floor, then she's supposed to just wait till he's done eating, because you don't want to approach a guy when he's hangry, I guess. Right? Wait till he's done, and watch where he goes down to lay down for the night, and then lift up the corner of his cover and crawl in next to his feet. I mean, it's kind of weird, isn't it? And yet also kind of weirdly provocative. Like, what is she doing here? Most of us would say that, like, it's nighttime, she's all dressed up, They don't go out to dinner first. She just crawls to a sleeping bag. It's a little weird. But we're not given the indication that that's what happened at all. Quite the opposite, really. That they have this little story and he sends her home and he doesn't want her to get exposed and have any kind of an idea that there may be something promiscuous had taken place. But she says to him something that's kind of interesting. Let's pick it up in verse 8 of chapter 3. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Spread your wings. If we go back to chapter 2, verse 12, what was his prayer? His prayer was that the Lord would provide for you, under whose wings you have come. He acknowledged her kindness. He repaid the kindness. He prayed for God's blessing, and now he has an opportunity to be the answer to that prayer and to cover her. It means to provide for her. It means to make sure that she's protected. And then, like every great Hallmark romance movie, there's a but. Right? There's this fiance from New York. It just kind of throws a wrench in the plan. Now, in this situation, there's another redeemer that's closer. And if this redeemer wants to redeem the property and the women, he has the first right of refusal to do that. And so Boaz says, "Hey, go home. Here's some more food. Take care of your family. I'll be in touch. I'm going to reach out." So he does, chapter 4. He connects with the other guy, the other relative, and says, "Hey, Naomi's back. And the property that belonged to Elimelech, like, it's available. You're the closest redeemer. Do you want it?" Yes, I want the property." And he did. He wanted the land, but he didn't want the ladies. Right? Because it might hinder his own legacy. And so he bows out and Boaz steps up. And Boaz is the kinsman redeemer, the one that would save the family. And at the end of chapter 4, we begin to see some stories unfold that maybe we hadn't seen before. Boaz took Ruth and they conceived and bore a son. This barren woman who was widowed and alone in a foreign land is now welcomed, loved, provided for, married, and has child. And then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel." That son's name was Obed. Doesn't mean a whole lot other than Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David. David became the king of Israel, the man after God's own heart. We go down and we read the end of this, and it's like this whole story plays out, and it looks an awful lot like another list of genealogy found in Matthew chapter 1, page 807. Now, I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll pick up in verse 4. "And Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab." Rahab, by the way, goes back to Joshua entering into Jericho. She was the prostitute that was in the wall that provided for the Israelites. "And Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth the Moabite," not the Israelite. But she chose God. "Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of David the king." And then in verse 16, "And Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born and called the Christ." Ruth's story may seem pretty insignificant. And in the time of Judges, when everybody did what was right in their own eyes, she had this amazing hesed kindness for her family, to which Boaz poured out his kindness over her. And the redemption of Ruth, the adoption into the family of Israel, that went above and beyond any of the pain that they had experienced, was actually pointing them to the greatest Redeemer of all in Jesus Christ. And your pain and my pain will also point us to the redemption of Jesus Christ. Because He's the only one that can heal the brokenness inside. He's the only one that's able to really buy us back. So here's 3 questions to help you process the story today. Number 1, how has God provided for you in difficult times? This may be hard for you if you're going through difficulties right now, but perspective is everything. Right? Because if when we're going through difficult times, we can look back and go, God provided for me when times were difficult. It shapes our perspective and it gives us gratitude and it gives us faith that God can be there yet again. Right? So where has God provided for you in your difficult times? Question number 2, who around you is going through some difficulties right now? Who around you is going through some difficulties right now? And then question 3, what can you do to come alongside of them? Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. But I want to change the last part of this, because it's not about their God, it's about your God. It's about you stepping into their brokenness and bringing your God along the journey and giving them a reason for the hope that you have, so that they too may see a hope that's on the horizon in Jesus Christ. So there's probably 2 groups of people in here today, for the most part. Those who are broken and hurting and struggling and looking for an answer, a hope, redemption. My prayer is that you would find it in Jesus, and that you would allow the church to come alongside of you in that brokenness, rather than isolating. And so you're going to have an opportunity at the end of the service. We have a prayer team, and Victor and Aaron are going to be up here by the stage. And if you'd like them to pray over you through some difficult times, then they're going to be here to do that for you. You can also drop it in on the prayer wall or put it in the giving boxes in the back of the room if you'd like to go that route. But there are those of us who have already received the redemption through Jesus. And it's our responsibility to comfort others with the comfort that we've already received, to walk along the broken. That means that we have to be inconvenienced a bit. It means that we have to step away from comfort. We have to move from the seat of being a consumer to being a contributor. Right? We have to be keenly aware of the needs that are around us, so that we can be the hands and feet of Jesus to help those who are hurting. And guys, that's my challenge for us. That we can find redemption in Christ, but also that we can bring the redemption of Christ to others.